Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon to our event. My name is Jon Temin. I'm the director of the Sudan and South Sudan program here at USIP. You are in the right place. This is a Somalia event. Spend a bit of time on that as well. My first order of business here is just to ask you to please turn off or at least silence your cell phones so we can have an uninterrupted conversation here. Let me also welcome all the people who are watching this on our webcast and in some of the overflow rooms around the Institute here. It's nice to have such a big crowd in this room. This is a very opportune time to talk about Somalia. The original impetus for this event when we planned it months ago was around this new book by Mary Harper, who we have here today, called Getting Somalia Wrong. It just so happens there are a lot of recent events, I think, that will further enliven the conversation between the election of the new president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, and the conclusion of the transitional federal government. So I think we will discuss all these things, and we'll start with Mary Harper, who is the Africa editor at the BBC World Service, and so we're very pleased to have her here from London and from all of her travels in Somalia and elsewhere. And she is the author of the new book that I've read and very much enjoyed, and I know others have as well, called Getting Somalia Wrong. So she will talk about some of the main points in the book, and then also will get into some of the recent development and some views on those developments. Now, we're very fortunate to have two other people to talk about the book and about the recent developments as well. The first being Dr. Sadia Ali Aden, the co-founder of the Adar Foundation and the Somalia Diaspora Youth Organization. And the second one being Bronwyn Bruton, who is the deputy director of the Atlantic Council's Michael Ansari Africa Center, and as many of you know, someone who has written some very influential articles and reports on Somalia issues. So we will hear from each of them. We'll try to leave plenty of time for discussion. I think there are a lot of people in the audience who have a lot to add to the conversation today as well. So thank you for coming. Mary.
Greetings, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. And to the Somalis in the audience and elsewhere, Nabat Sodawada, it's very nice to have you here. And it's really great for me to be here in the United States and in Washington, D.C. in particular, so near to the State Department, where so much of US policy on Somalia is formed, and actually, I'm afraid to say, where also, so it was that policy really that in part inspired the title of my book, Getting Somalia Wrong. So it's slightly intimidating to be standing so near to that place, but I'll do my best. And in this sort of brief opening, as Jon said, I'll just talk about a couple of the main themes of my book, and then I will just briefly outline my thoughts on the very new political and military developments in Somalia. So, Getting Somalia Wrong. This book, it really was inspired by the way the US in particular responded to Somalia after the events of 9/11, and as one Somali businessman I know said to me, he said, you know, Mary, 9/11 changed everything for Somalia and everything for Somalis. It made our lives so much more difficult, and it did feel, as a journalist who's worked in and about Somalia for more than 20 years, after 9/11, the US in particular got locked into this kind of prism of, it could only see Somalia through the prism of Al-Qaeda, through the prism of the war on terror. And I do believe that the way it responded to what, as a journalist, I saw as a glimmer of hope for the people, at least of Mogadishu and southern Somalia in 2006, when a loose alliance of Sharia courts, I can't exactly say they came to power, but they did exert some authority, and even though they severely restricted certain aspects of people's behaviour, Somalis in those parts of Somalia that had been torn apart by violence for up to 20 years already they did say, well, at least we can go out even in the evening without being terrified of being shot. And the sort of US-led reaction to that, one of its main allies in the region, Ethiopia, they launched a massive offensive and invasion of Somalia to drive out this union of Sharia courts, which were presented as an Al-Qaeda-linked threat, where I certainly couldn't see much evidence for that at the time. And I think Somalis, some of the Somalis who disliked intensely that group of courts, they actually played into this whole terror, this fear of Al-Qaeda, because they presented themselves as an alliance to destroy what they described as terrorists, and they kind of got the Americans on their side. But by destroying and driving out that group of courts, this policy actually gave rise to the monster that it said it was trying to destroy, because out of that developed a much more extreme militia, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab. So it didn't make any sense to me, that kind of policy. And it's actually backfired not just on Somalis, Somalia and the Horn of Africa, it's also backfired on the United States. I mean, today there's a trial of a Somali in Minnesota who has been accused of aiding and abetting, recruiting Somalis to go back home to fight jihad. So it's a policy that actually has had serious impact on the United States as well as Africa far away. So that was sort of one part of getting Somalia wrong that I focus on in my book, and I take it way back to the early 90s when the Americans also got involved initially for very good reasons, for humanitarian reasons, to try to help starving people, but they ended up becoming part of the conflict. And then way back even before then, during the colonial times, Somalis have never dealt very well with foreign interference or intervention. And so actually it was Bronwyn Bruton, who I quote in my book, who suggested that maybe the best thing the United States could do would to adopt a policy of constructive disengagement from Somalia. And actually, in recent months, even though the US is still very, very sort of actively involved in trying to steer the way Somalia is moving militarily and politically, it has taken more of a back seat. It's not so public, and I wonder whether it has finally kind of got the message that the less visible it is, probably the better for Somalis and possibly the better for Americans as well. But that's not the only bit of getting Somalia wrong. One of the other main areas where I think that there have been huge problems is from people such as myself, from journalists, because they present this image of Somalia as one that is absolutely perfect for the stereotypical vision of Africa, which is a land of starving people. There's also the Al-Qaeda thrown into this mix. There's famine. Somalia has been named the world's most comprehensively failed state for 5 years in a row now. And then it added to that the added kind of childish romance of piracy. So the way that the media presents Somalia is a sort of very stereotypical, and I think it's a dangerously limiting way of looking at the country, and it completely contradicted what I saw when I went there. I could easily just report on those things because they do exist, but that's a minute part of the story of Somalia, and so I couldn't understand why things such as the incredible dynamism of the business community is not really mentioned. The fact that there are regions, in particular the breakaway self-declared Republic of Somaliland in the northwest, but many others as well, which function as, I mean, you can't call them countries, but to lesser or greater degrees, they function as highly effective polities. There's also women's groups, youth groups, people in the diaspora who are doing a tremendous amount of good for Somalia. And somehow all of those things tend to be ignored, I think, by big powers such as the United States, which have this kind of obsession with Mogadishu, which I think is quite unhealthy, because Mogadishu is just one part of Somalia. and also an obsession with it being a sort of chess piece to be played with in the war on terror. So those are two of the main themes that I address in my book. In terms of where is Somalia likely to go now, after the so-called ending of 20 years of political transition, even though the new government that is being formed, I don't think of it exactly as a sort of completely different thing than what we've seen before, because even though the United Nations and other powers in their sort of rhetoric, they say, oh, this is a Somali-led process. From my experience of watching this at very, very close quarters, it's not really a Somali-led process. It's funded by the United States. I mean, in places like when I've seen political agreements being made in Mogadishu or in Addis Ababa this year, the United States in particular and the United Nations have been literally kind of grabbing people by their shoulders and forcing them together or threatening to turn off the tap. So I don't think you can call it a Somali-owned or a Somali-led process, but it is more Somali-owned than it was before. And I think the fact that the new president who was elected is somebody, not only is he not as far as we know, associated with the violence or the corruption of previous political leaders. He's also somebody who stayed behind in Somalia, because a lot of the politicians are people who come back from the diaspora. So I think he does have a huge amount of credibility with many different Somalis, and certainly when he was elected, my phone was just ringing from left, right and centre from Somalis all over the world, saying that they thought he was a good choice. So, you know, good luck to him. But his challenges are so massive. And when I wrote a piece of analysis on the day that he was elected, I actually used the word, I said, no one could really blame him if he actually feels physically unwell at the prospect of governing Somalia. And I'll just briefly outline three of what I see are his main challenges. The first is one that he himself said, you know, my priority is security, and then security, and then security. And you know, it's not just the general security in Somalia, it's his own personal security. As I'm sure a lot of you know, a couple of days after he was elected, the hotel where he's staying in was suicide bombed. So he has to worry about that. And also, I was in Mogadishu last month, and the way it's portrayed in the media, I think once again the journalists are getting Somalia wrong, because they're portraying Mogadishu as some kind of paradise where people go to the beach and everyone from the diaspora is rushing back to rebuild and invest. But that is a sort of a bit like you could report on Somalia as a land of pirates. It's just, I think, as irresponsible to report on Mogadishu now as this wonderful place, because it's incredibly unpredictable and dangerous, and it's not an easy place to sort of rebuild peace in. And one thing that I noticed is the fact that so many people are armed, and when you ask them, like, now you have relative peace in Mogadishu, you know, why don't you sort of hand over responsibility for security to the African Union peacekeepers or the Somali security forces? And they're just like, we don't, no way, are you mad to even suggest that? We don't trust them. So I think until some kind of, I don't know, until the Somali security forces really are given more responsibility and more credibility, it's difficult to know how things are going to change in terms of it being such a militarized society. Another massive challenge facing the new president is the presence of all these foreign forces in Somalia. You know, Kismayo, this sort of last urban stronghold of al-Shabaab, has now, I wouldn't say exactly it's fallen, because al-Shabaab, as usual, just decided to leave, and they've melted away. So they haven't been militarily defeated. But who is going to control Kismayo? At the moment, it's foreign forces plus Somali soldiers. And I think unless foreign forces have quite an urgently sort of decided exit strategy, they're going to become part of the problem. Somali's patience is going to run out with them very soon, and also having Kenyan troops and Ethiopian troops on Somali soil, it is possible that that's going to lead to serious problems between Kenya and Ethiopia, as well as for their relationship with Somalia. And finally, there's another area where I think that there could be problems, and I fear that the Somali conflict might not end now. It might just change, and it might become more of a conflict between the different regions of Somalia, because they've gone it alone for so long, and they've operated as independent entities. It's difficult to see how, number one, a central government is going to establish any kind of unity across the territory, and also how their relationships are going to be between each other, because you already see in the more stable parts of Somalia, such as Somaliland in the northwest, and then there's a semi-autonomous region, Puntland, to the south of it. They have a sort of quietly running conflict. There's another region in between there that's just declared itself as a separate state. So I can see Somalia becoming a place where it's no longer a conflict with an Islamist militia as much as a conflict between different competing regions. So that is another, just a final challenge for the president to maintain a sort of tough but I suppose distant relationship with those territories. So I'll now hand over to the other panelists. Thank you very much for having me. Thanks.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Mary. It's a great pleasure to finally meet you after reading so many of your articles over the years, and I want to thank you very much for writing such a wonderful book on Somalia. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, it really is marvelous. In particular, I think it's a great primer on the Somali conflict. It actually talks about a lot of things, including cot and camels, that are important. And in particular, the concept of Greater Somalia, which underlies so much of the modern political evolution of the country, and yet is very rarely raised in policy briefs that have to be 20 pages or less. So I really highly recommend it. In particular, I want to point out that Mary's book does a very, very great job of talking about the real roots of the Somali conflict. In American discourse particularly, it's very common to say that Somalia has been an anarchy since 1991, and it's been metastasizing since 1991, when the reality is that the problems go back further and are really rooted in the Siad Barre regime. Mary really explores that, and in addition talks a lot about the role that international actors have played in Somalia's crisis, which is another area that people tend either to focus on too much or not to talk about enough. And her book is very balanced. So again, I really recommend reading it. There's so much to talk about today, and I'm going to try to restrain myself. It's not easy to do, but obviously we'll have a wonderful dialogue session after the remarks. I did want to go back a little bit, however, to set the stage for our later conversation. And I wanted to talk about Somalia's recent history and the recent events in Mogadishu. As I've been reading press reporting, what I've noticed is that there have been a lot of references to the way that al-Shabaab was driven out of Mogadishu. And I think that stepping back a bit and remembering what's happened might actually help us to assess what's going to happen moving forward. Since May of 2009, there has been a terrible stalemate, or there had been a terrible stalemate in Mogadishu. This stalemate resulted from a number of different factors, but primarily it was caused by the fact that there was no one entity on the ground that was capable of taking power in Mogadishu. You had AMISOM dug into a corner of the city, quite content to be where it was, not eager to retake the city as a whole. Essentially, the international community felt that they controlled Mogadishu because they had Whither Somalia, and AMISOM didn't want to die trying to take control of the larger city. Al-Shabaab was trying desperately to seize Mogadishu, but had not been able to do so. It had the Ramadan offensive at the end of 2010, in which it tried desperately, and nearly did, take control of the airport, Whither Somalia, and other important installations, but it failed. And after many, many casualties, particularly the Rahanweyn fighters, who were making up the bulk of al-Shabaab's forces at that time, didn't want to try dying again. So there seemed to be no possibility that al-Shabaab could actually seize control of Mogadishu. At the same time, the Kampala bombings had taken place, and it had seemed for a moment possible that would be interpreted as al-Shabaab's evolution into a transnational terrorist organization, an al-Qaeda affiliate. But nothing happened. The U.S. didn't decide that it was going to put boots on the ground in Somalia. They didn't spend huge millions of dollars trying to bolster AMISOM. Essentially, there was a real sense of gridlock, that nothing was going to move. Even the TFG, which when it was created caused great anxiety in Somali circles, had become a non-entity, essentially. Individual actors in the TFG were sitting in Whither Somalia getting very rich, but there wasn't really any sense that they were being actively supported by the international community. They weren't any kind of a threat to anyone. The way that Ken Menkhaus was describing it at the time, for example, was to say that no one was winning, but no one was losing. And his assessment was that the stalemate could really go on for years and years and years. And in fact, everybody was surprised, really surprised, when in early August 2011, al-Shabaab decided to shoulder their weapons and mostly walk out of the city. They were not defeated, as Mary pointed out in the case of Kismayo. They left. And the reason that they left was not because AMISOM was doing everything right, but because AMISOM was not really doing anything wrong. They weren't disruptive. They were being quiet. They were allowing the Somalis to lead in a sense. And what caused al-Shabaab to give up was primarily the fact that the Somalis didn't like them. They weren't popular. They weren't gaining ground. They weren't achieving anything new. And more than anything else, they were really disliked. And essentially what happened was they were allowed to lead. The international community, not because necessarily they were very wise, but because at least they were very cautious, sat back and allowed the situation to evolve. And I think that that's an incredibly important lesson as we move forward into this new stage of Somalia's political evolution. AMISOM has learned a lot of great lessons. They stopped their civilian casualties, and I'm not talking about Kenya here when I say AMISOM, I mean Burundi and Uganda. And they did that right. And in particular, the United States, too, although it made a supportive contribution with its kinetic strikes on high-value targets, was also very restrained. They didn't target Hassan Dahir Awais, they didn't target Mukhtar Robo, or other Somali leaders who had clan constituencies. They restrained themselves to targeting foreign, high-value al-Qaeda operatives who were not involved in Somalia's conflict. Again, I think it's a real example of dealing with the U.S. enemies without trying to be disruptive to political events on the ground. There's a real fear now that those fragile gains will be reversed. And I'm going to quickly point out a couple of those challenges so as not to take up too much time. The primary concern that I see at the moment is the Kenyan invasion and presumably occupation of Kismayo. From my perspective, I think that this is probably an example, again, of getting it wrong. If you look at the Shabaab withdrawal from Mogadishu, which resulted after a stalemate and was essentially a voluntary move by al-Shabaab, this is the opposite. This is the Kenyans attempting to push by force what had not given naturally. And in the case of Kenya, it's very problematic because all of their actions are bound to be perceived rightly or wrongly, accurately or inaccurately, through a clan lens. The Kenyans were not necessarily very wise in entering Kismayo with the Ras Kamboni and with the TFG contingent that was primarily composed of Ogadeni clan members. The fact that there have been rumors that Bara Harale may come back into the city, the fact that the Kenyan defense minister is himself an Ogadeni clan member, all of these are things that will not help the Kenyans to govern what is really a minefield, a long-standing minefield of clan conflict. In saying that I'm concerned about this, I don't mean to imply that I'm concerned about al-Shabaab suddenly becoming popular among Somalis, but it may certainly lead to a period of instability in Kismayo, and perhaps more worryingly, it may lead to instability in Kenya. Kenya has a growing homegrown radicalization problem. and its antics in Somalia are not likely to help very much. I'll simply flag that and move forward. Another tremendous challenge for the United States in particular is the fact that it looks likely that AMISOM's time in Somalia is running short. There's growing anxiety in Somalia about the occupation of AMISOM forces. They are not necessarily unpopular, but they're certainly not liked. And there's, I think, growing murmurs that while Kenyan, Burundian, and Ugandan troops are making a lot of money defending Somalis, the Somali National Army is not growing rapidly. Somalis are not being paid with the same regularity or with the same four-figure salaries a month. And I think that that's provoking a certain amount of concern, which will only grow as the months grow forward. And so it's important for the US, the United Nations, and the African Union to be thinking now about what comes next. Obviously, that's going to be a big challenge because the linchpin of the international efforts in Somalia have been AMISOM. Having said that, I do also want to say that there are some really positive things going on here. I think it's wonderful that civil society is finally taking a turn in Whither Somalia. I share Mary's concern about being over-optimistic. Yes, it's the same quote-unquote government that we've had before. But I'm also hopeful that if Hassan Sheikh can at least remain honest and can at least try hard to represent the will of the whole Somali people, that he will make an important contribution and will perhaps help Somalis to feel that central government doesn't have to be their enemy. I hope that we won't set the bar too high for his performance and will help him to win. More important than that, I think that the most hopeful thing for Somalia is the fact that at this time there is no one actor who is really leading the field. The United States has been burned by its policy in Somalia, and it doesn't want to be in front. Also, we all have budget issues now that will make it impossible for any one country to really play a decisive role on the ground. But there are lots of countries, including Turkey and other Muslim nations, that are really trying to make a difference in a positive way. And in a best case scenario, what that will result in is a lot of different pies for a lot of different people, and hopefully less of that winner-take-all dynamic that's been so corrosive in the past. If the international community can do that, and if they can keep the focus on economic development and economic opportunities, I actually think that the prognosis for Somalia might start to look rather bright.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Jon. Thank you for USIP for hosting this. Whenever we thought we were losing hope, especially those of us in the activism business, USIP has been here, and we were always grateful. Mary Harper, the title of the book says it all. Getting Somalia Wrong. When I got the book and I look at the title, I say to myself, Mary got half of the work done for her by just naming the book, Getting Somalia Wrong. And this is unfortunately what we have been saying for many years, especially those of us like myself who grew up with this civil war. From when the war started, I was in college, and since did graduate school, medical school, got married, and have 2 babies since the war. So that tells you that I've been engraved in this war, and so are many other Somalis. I see so many Somalis here in the audience today who have been also in this struggle. And from the election of this new president, with the selection of this president, there seems to be hope. And I hope with your book, which I believe is the beginning, and I hope there will be a sequel to it on how people can get it right, completely dedicated to it, will hopefully provide some of the policies that can come out of Washington. failed state, some of the stereotypes that Mary has talked about is the stereotyping that has taken place since the war started, especially the last few years. Somalia was named every book in the name, every name in the book. Failed state, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, piracy country, you name it, everything. Unfortunately, what people did not realize, especially journalists, and I hate to say this because the mainstream media really have lost track of the reality on the ground, because superficially what Mary has talked about is what the media has seen, or at least the mainstream media, and that's the way I've comprehended your book when you were talking about it, is that everyone was talking about the civil war, everyone was talking about the chaos, the piracy, the extremists that have been produced from the many failed international foreign policies. But no one really has talked about the hidden resilience of the Somali people. No one has talked about the progress that they have made in stateless for 20 years, yet they have survived. And it was not because they were getting aid from outside only, but really majority was because the people of Somalia, regardless of their clan affiliation, regional affiliation, they were able to give back. So failed state is not a permanent. State. It's reversible if people have the will to reverse it, and this has been shown within the Somali community. And because of what we see right now, there is a hope that the Somalis will finally succeed in reversing the trend of the failed state that becomes synonymous with Somalia. So going back to the book, the descriptions are true, and I'm glad you started that with the book, because that's where Mary starts with the book. I don't usually finish books. I'm one of those people who start books and then leave in the middle and then come back and then skip to the end because I have so much to do. But I have to admit, I did read this book, and as you can see with all these stickies, I have all these little notes that I put in each. And the reason is because you talked about everything. Again, this book doesn't cover everything because it's a small book, but you have covered much more than we have seen over the years. So what's true is that so much suffering has taken place in Somalia. Civil wars, civil or otherwise, destroy lives. And in Somalia that we have seen, there has been a serious and tremendous destruction of civilians, especially women, children, elderly, and minorities, which is one of the clans that Mary talked about, the 4.5 formula, or the clan structure in Somalia. Another issue that Mary talked about is the Greater Somalia from the colonial days, when Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, the hero of the Somali society who fought against the colonial powers like the English, fought, and where that issue also is dear and near to the heart of Somali people. So that issue is also an issue that has been covered. And then Mary talked about the clan structure of the Somali society. The interesting thing was the clan structure that I've seen, the one you used is from I.M. Lewis, 1965. And what he presented was more clans than I knew. But then I think the unfortunate thing there with Lewis was because he did not do, or he did not have the opportunity as what you have done. You were able to speak to different people. You had access to either the reporters that you work with, or you visited different parts of Somalia, where I.M. Lewis, I think, was stuck with the individual at the colonial time or after that, was guiding him and then telling him where to go and what to read or who to talk to. But you had much more exposure. So I hope that you will be able to write in your next books, talking to other authors who are some Somalis and others have gone beyond what Lewis has done. Another issue that I noticed that the book that talked about is the foreign intervention you went extensively on that, and that was, for someone like myself, I was enjoying that because Mary has talked about what foreign intervention has done to Somalia. What we have seen with this book is that they talked about many things, but number one, the first one that showed that the international community got it wrong was the Black Hawk Down. After the Operation Restore Hope in 1992, there was the infamous incident of Black Hawk Down, where the United States withdrew, when 18 servicemen were killed against the warlord Aden. United States withdrew, and then UN followed. And there was a total disengagement from Somalis until 9/11. And then that's where Mary talks about the re-engagement was not positive. It was in the allying Somalia on the war, not allying, but using Somalia as a base to fight terror. So the war on terror. And that unfortunately became giving another opportunity for the warlords to take advantage of the policy of the United States of America and the international community, where they have captured and delivered the people who were against them, either politically or because they were not warlords, but they were scholars or traditional leaders, and they ended up in these camps where they were, of course, ended up in rendition programs. So that was a failed policy. Again, not only at the beginning, the United States withdrawing without really re-engaging, because what happened at the beginning was successful. Lives were saved because hundreds of thousands of people were dying, died, 5,000 kids were dying under the age of 5. So the mission was successful at the beginning, so I don't want to undermine that. But after the withdrawal and then the re-engagement, so many years of not engaging Somalia was September 11th. And then, when that was not successful, Islamic courts came to life, Union of Islamic Courts, which was a grassroots movement that resulted from the warlords capturing civilians, scholars, traditional leaders, and delivering them to those that they thought had the high bidder. And Mary mentioned in the book where the CIA and United States government were engaging with these warlords, giving them money so they can capture these people. So that was also another failed policy. So the Islamic courts came to power, and of course, again, Mary talks about where the United States supports the invasion of Ethiopia in December 2006, and that was another way of getting Somalia wrong, and of course, a failed policy here in Washington, and of course, the international community that supported the idea. And then we have seen what happened. What Mary talks about in the book, and the activists had talked about for so many years, and you have vindicated some of the things that the activists have been saying, and some of the scholars, and those who really wanted the United States to re-examine this foreign policy, especially the one towards Somalia, was when you talked about the Islamic courts truly had extreme elements, and they were the Shabab, but they were subdued because the Islamic courts were much more stronger. But because the Ethiopians have destroyed Islamic courts, you had now the Al-Shabaab produced. So that was the product of the Islamic courts, Union of Islamic Courts being destroyed. Again, the book talks about so many other things. The clan structure, the way it talked about it, and the way it talked about how it breaks down from the different major clans and then into sub clans until you get to, as Mary said, to a few number of individuals, sometimes just a family. Like that is true, and I appreciated that. And then Mary talked about the poetry. Somalis are famous for poetry, for their poetry. In fact, there are so many websites and even Facebook that you will find where talks the land of poets. And it's beautiful, the Somali poetry, whether it's a women's or men, or depending on the regions also. And that helped them survive. And the poetry, as Mary has talked about, and I was appreciating this very much, was always about either women, love, wars, or camels, which Somalis love camels. And Mary talked about the nomads there, and then she talked about the resilience of the people of Somalia, the nomads, in the harsh environment that they live in, how they can adapt to everything. There are things that are a little bit sensitive in the eyes of the Somali people, and that I will be able to address later in the question and answer session. But overall, the book was wonderful. I recommend everyone to read. But of course, it didn't cover everything, and she cannot be expected to cover everything in this small book. But she has done a much better job than anybody else. I respect you for the work that you have done, and I hope you will continue. And your recommendations on allowing Somalis to come up with their own solutions because of what the northwest of Somalia has done, Somaliland, and the Union of Islamic Courts, which was grassroots found solution, that also was another wonderful thing. And you have gone so much to say that should be used as a model for the rest of the Somalia. And that was great. And then Mary talked about the piracy. One thing that I did not see unless I overlooked is the toxic waste dumping, which I called in my testimony before the House ticking environmental bomb. That's a serious issue, and I hope you will address that. So rest I hope we'll talk about it in the question and answer session.
Thank you very much, all three of you. We will go to Q&A now. I'm going to take advantage of my position and ask the first question, and then we'll turn to the audience. All three of you touched on a lot of things. One thing that you didn't spend so much time on, just probably because of time constraints, but is very relevant, I think, in this setting, is the diaspora. Mary, you noted the fact that because the new president was not part of the diaspora is an advantage to him at the moment. So I wonder if you can go a little bit deeper into how you see the role of the diaspora, positive and negative, in terms of how things have gotten to where they are now, but also how the diaspora plays a more productive role going forward, to all three of you.
Yeah, the Somali diaspora is problematic. I'll start with. Can you hear me? Is this on? Yeah, yeah. I'll start with the positive. The things that I've seen with my own eyes in my many trips to Somalia and Somaliland is an increasing number of diaspora people coming back either permanently or having one foot there and one foot somewhere else. In fact, an academic called Laura Hammond, I don't know if you've heard of her, but she works a lot on Somalia, and she says she doesn't really think diaspora is a very appropriate term for the Somali diaspora. She prefers to call them something like the part-time diaspora, because so many Somalis are both rooted in Somalia, Somaliland or elsewhere, and somewhere else. And the positive things that I've seen are things like people coming home with huge amounts of education. Lots of Somalis, as I write about in my book, are very good at making money, so they come back and invest not just tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars, but millions of dollars wherever they can, and they're amazing risk takers. They'll go somewhere like Mogadishu, where there is still gunfire, firefights, suicide bombs, grenades. It really is a very jittery, nervous place, and they're building. They'll see a hole in the market, and they'll, like I wrote about one Somali who set up dry cleaners because he noticed that Somali businessmen and politicians like wearing suits, and they were having to send them to Nairobi or Addis Ababa to be dry cleaned. So he set up dry cleaners in Mogadishu. But then I also think that the diaspora can play a very negative role, particularly in politics and with the media, because they're safe if they're in Washington or in London or Kenya or elsewhere in Dubai. So they can sort of play politics from afar without fear of being shot or suicide bombed. And they can write all sorts of incredibly irresponsible, non-journalistic journalism from their living rooms outside Somalia. So I do kind of feel that there's a virtual, at least previously, maybe not so much right now, but there was a kind of virtual war being conducted by elements of the diaspora through the internet, and also sometimes with their money, backing people who were incredibly destructive at home. So even though I think that the diaspora can and does do a huge amount of positive things for Somalia, I think in almost equal measure they have been negative.
Well, since I'm one of the diaspora, perhaps I should comment on that. I do agree to some extent that there is sometimes it can have a negative impact because, as you say, it's more of like a part-time. They go. Even we have seen it with some of the members of the government who took off a year off from their work, and then things did not work out, came back. But the diaspora has contributed to the survival of the Somali society. The Somalis in the diaspora, when you talk about especially the remittance, do send 1.5 billion last that we knew per year to Somalia. And it's not that they send it just to fund organization or business of their own, but they invest in people, sending to family members, friends, neighbors that they knew. And that's also some of the beauty of how this whole clan is sometimes overrated, because you have people supporting people that were their neighbors that was not even related to them. Just because that they were neighbors or they knew or they went to same school together, they called. And this is a continuous process. As of today, until today, every morning, I think I'm one of the few people who get maybe 2 calls every morning, but there are more people who get more calls from Somalia asking for help, either because they have a child who is sick, or they run out of food and they need something to buy milk or rations for their kids, or they need to travel because they need to migrate from one area to the other, or someone died and they need to bury them. So really the diaspora has been a positive force in so many ways. So I just wanted to add that, so the diaspora is not seen as a negative tool that always creates a problem.
Well, those were such thorough answers. I don't have too much to throw in the mix, except I would say that when I visited Mogadishu shortly after Sheikh Sharif took power, one of the complaints that I heard constantly was that for the first time there were actually good jobs to be had in Mogadishu, and the diaspora had all of them. So I think moving forward, what's really important as Mogadishu becomes more of an investment destination and the economy becomes more important, and as the government grows, local Somalis who have not been abroad and who possibly don't have the same technocratic capacities do need to find a place, and they need to be included, and I think people need to be very coherent about how that's done.
Okay, we'll turn to questions in the audience, please. So please raise your hand when you have one. I ask you to give me your name and your affiliation, and please keep questions short so we can try to squeeze them in. Let's start right here, please.
I'm a big voice, so they can hear me. First, we thank the institution and thank you very much for writing a book. Like I would say, I think the name says all, just because of the together, I think we spoke for people and the innocent for millions of people, just what the Highland say, getting someone, it's a shame, and the war should be discussed by, not still by, for the last 20 years, superpowers like the United States, British, and the Western world. Aside from that, the only two policies that came from the United States is the containment policy, which is choking out people, and also the dual track policy. That's all I do. Dual track policy, which has not succeeded by the way, but I probably encourage some areas or some regions to get dual roads. From the State Department, it was stay the dual track policy will work. It hasn't worked. So that bet, and the people have been choked for many years. Due to that policy, it has radicalized our own people. Basically, the Shabab was a minor thing. The United States was after 4 or 5 or whatever Al-Qaeda people who were affiliated with either Afghanistan or Pakistan or whatever country. But they were not concerned with the drones even. And those who they have assassinated, they were not Somali like the other two. Now, well,
Sorry, let me ask you to start to wind up, please.
I'm coming to that. The past is bad. There's so much to talk about, unfortunately. We're talking about now. We have been told the conclusion of TFG. In other words, there will be a permanent government in Somalia. I hope the United States, I'm sure some people from the State Department are here. We want them to open an embassy here if they support this government. If they say that they're spending so much money and they are supportive of the new president, well, you got to encourage the new president and give him some leeway as far as running the country. Thank you very much for the time and for the book that you wrote.
Thank you. Also, my apologies, I messed up. For people who want to ask questions, we have these 2 microphones on the side of the room, so I would ask you to please line up behind those microphones if you do have a question. But let's go to this question. Any particular responses, Mary or others?
I'll comment quickly on a couple of things. You say, you use the word disgusting for the fact that what you call the superpowers didn't stabilize Somalia. But I do think that Somalis also should take responsibility. I have actually been criticized, I think rightly, with my book for not, by Somalis, for not putting enough responsibility on the Somalis themselves for the trouble that they've caused, not only their own people, but actually the rest of the world. So I do think that that's something that's sometimes missing from the discussion. And when you look at Somaliland in particular, nobody really stabilized Somaliland. It did it on its own, and from the grassroots it devised a political system that works pretty well. I mean, I think Somaliland is the most democratic territory in the Horn and East of Africa. They've had several elections where power has been transferred to the opposition. There's been very close run elections, and there's a hybrid political system that marries some of the good things about Somali clan politics with some of the good things about Western style democracy. So I think it's too easy just to say it's up to the superpowers to sort out Somalia. There was another thing you said that I thought was interesting, was about asking if the people from the State Department could put some pressure on opening an embassy in Mogadishu. And Bronwyn mentioned the Turks. My last visit to Somalia, I spent a lot of time with the Turkish community in Mogadishu, and it is quite extraordinary. I don't know whether I'm going too far if I say that in just 1 year, the Turks have done more for the Somali people than the United States and the United Nations and others have done in 20 years, because it is extraordinary. They have an embassy right in the heart of Mogadishu. They have teachers and doctors living in the heart of Mogadishu. They don't go out much, sensibly, and when they do, they have security. But they treat the Somalis in a completely different way. They say, they're our Muslim brothers and sisters. We're not here for the long term. We want to train them so that they can do their own schools and their own hospitals. But their attitude towards Somalis is so different than the other foreigners who are locked in the airport in this kind of, it looks like a movie where they live. It's completely surreal, this kind of heavy militarized zone. And you think, okay, maybe the Turks are naive and they're taking risks, but it is interesting that only one Turkish person has been killed in Mogadishu since they came a year ago, and he was a businessman who got into a fight in Bakara Market. So I do think that there's a lot to learn from the Turkish example in Somalia, and I think the Turks will gain massively in Africa as a result of that.
On the policy, the dual track policy, it's I'm glad you raised that, and you did mention that in your book, Mary. The dual track policy, since it is establishment, we have almost another dozen regions that have proclaimed to be states with their own president, their own foreign minister, and you name it, all these other cabinets. So the dual track policy, in fact, has contributed to the problem of Somalia, because now you have multiple regions all claiming to be independent from the rest. And the reason is because the issue of federalism, which you also raised in the book, Mary. Federalism, the way it has not been debated, it has not been discussed. It's an issue that's new to the Somali society. So now everyone is rushing to establish a region, because the agreement is, if you have two regions uniting, they can join the federalism and become a state, like within United States. And to do that, they have to do that. So you have a tiny village that's claiming to be a state, and someone in the diaspora, and this is where I agree with what you said in the book, all these presidents in the diaspora who are president of a region or a village in Somalia who have not done anything for the region. So you have all these people, these things going on, and that's why this federalism issue needs to also to be re-examined and allow the Somalis to discuss, debate, and decide what's right for them, what kind of governance system is right for them. As for the Turks, I was in Somalia 2011 taking part in feeding the famine victims. And what I've seen is exactly what you talked about, and it's amazing. Also, I've seen the clinics that they have established in Mogadishu. It was amazing. It was like McDonald's. Everywhere that you go, you'll find Turkish clinic. And when I came back, I did talk to members of the USAID, and I said I felt ashamed as an American citizen when I went back that I did not see members of our government or organizations doing this. And they said, oh, because the lady responded to me saying, oh, we rebranded the USAID's support because we didn't want Somalis to get angry. And I said, well, we're using the drones, and we're not rebranding those. Why are we rebranding the support, the humanitarian support? And she didn't respond to that. And I think that's why it's very important that United States, really gets involved in the humanitarian portion. And one last thing I want to mention, if it's okay, is the Turks. I don't know if you were following this. The United Nations General Assembly that just finished. There was a Somali summit, UN Somali summit, and the Turkish, Qatar, and the United Emirates have brought a proposal where they wanted to take the lead to build Somali security forces. But of course, our Secretary, United States, Clinton, have said that the proposal has to go through a committee. And guess who is a member of this committee that Somalis have to get approved for the Turkish and the Qatar and the Emirates to build their security? It's the Ethiopians, the Ugandese, the Kenyans, and other international members. So this is where now the question has to be asked, and we need to challenge the system. That is Somalia is still in transition, or it has a permanent government that can, in fact, sign bilateral agreements and make decisions for their own people. This is very essential, and I think, and I truly believe that this is what we need to do, and this is where, Mary, with your journalism, and now with your expert thesis here, that you can address this issue and hopefully take it beyond where it is.
Great. Let's take two more questions, one from each side, please. So please, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Nia Kwete. I work here in Washington with a group called ADNA. I haven't read the book. I intend to. I even hope to maybe review it. Bruton said that you went back into the history of Somalia. I was glad to hear that, because I happen to think, and I was wondering whether you agree or disagree, that the original step in getting Somalia wrong, at least by the United States, was driven by the Cold War, by President Carter switching U.S. support from the Ethiopians to the Somalis and Siad Barre. And therefore, I think, the present history and all the programs mentioned, I think I agree, but I think it will help to understand how the U.S. first began to get Somalia wrong. And it's part of a pattern of supporting dictators not just in Somalia, but all over Africa. So I was wondering if you would agree with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go here as well, please.
My name is Deirdre Lepin. I am with the African Studies Center at the University of Pennsylvania. I served in Somalia with the United Nations for 3.5 years up until 1990 when we were all evacuated. And so these errors in approaching the country have been painful to watch ever since that time. Now there were 2 points that were mentioned. One was the need to balance regional interests or clan interests with the hope, perhaps, of a future unified government. The second is that the capital importance of economic development of the country. Now, my crystal ball tells me that there's one potential issue which wasn't mentioned yet, which would have an impact on both of these, positive and potentially negative, and that is oil. In the mid-'80s, there was quite a lot of exploration for oil in the northeast of Somalia. Conoco was present. There have been other companies since that time. Conoco had a great interest in promoting peace, and in fact, it was the managing director of Conoco in Somalia that held the first negotiations between Ali Mahdi and Aden. I don't know if many of you remember that. In the Conoco compound, that was because the international community was not responding to the situation. But since then, the oil companies have been quite quiet. So do you see any prospects, positive or negative, in the realm of oil exploration and development and production?
Good question. Bronwyn, you want to start on those two?
Sure, thanks. I don't know about everybody else, but I've been watching the sale of the oil concessions over the years with great amusement. I wish that I had put money on how often those things could be sold and resold. I mean, it's a great point. Obviously, oil resources have been a severe curse on some nations, and they've been a real boon to others. I would suggest that, you know, the history of governance in Somalia doesn't lead one to be particularly optimistic about what oil will do for the country. But, you know, it's possible to be wrong. I really hope that the government will get its act together and that there will be a reasonable distribution of those resources. But in the short term, what one worries about is that it will be an additional source of conflict between Somaliland and Puntland and between the northern regions and the south. And that would be my prediction in the short term, is that actually that's going to increase conflict on the ground as opposed to really helping. That said, it's fairly evident that the intervention of the Turks and other actors is at least partially motivated by the probability that there's going to be oil in Somalia's future, and so in that sense, it's been very positive. It's genuinely a mixed bag.
If
And
I
the first question as well.
Yeah, I was going to just briefly give my thoughts on the history question. As Bronwyn said at the beginning, you know, the problems of Somalia and the problems of foreign intervention in Somalia go back way beyond the early 1990s, and the 1970s was a very clear example of that, which was really started by the Soviets swapping their support from the Somalis to the Ethiopians, which then led to less robust than the Somalis were hoping US support for them. But it goes back way beyond that, when, like Sadia mentioned, this man who the British nicknamed the Mad Mullah and the Somalis called him the Sayyid. He's one of their heroes, their warrior poets, who led a rebellion against the colonial interests of the Ethiopians, the British, the Italians, the French, and actually that was the first time that the British used military air power against Africa. So in a way, these US drones that are being used in Somalia now, you know, way back, decades and decades ago, the British were kind of doing the same thing. So Somalia is somewhere, partly because of its geographical placing in the world, has always been somewhere that unlike a lot of Africa, which kind of looks in on itself, Somalia looks outwards and upwards, slightly towards the Arab world, but it's always going to be somewhere that the outside world is interested in. So I think Somalis have to learn how to deal with outsiders, because outsiders are always going to be trying to have some kind of influence over them. Yeah.
Quickly on the clan balance issue, I believe if the Somalis were left to come up with their own solutions, as we have seen the other regions have succeeded, and with the Union of Islamic Courts, as Mary has mentioned in the book, they will be able to resolve a lot of issues. Somalis are able to find solution when they're left to sit down and dialogue, and given the time and the space to have that dialogue. So I think that's only they can decide really what happens with them as far as the individual clans or the regions are concerned. As for the oil, I have that fear too, where it could become a curse, because oil has not been good news for many countries. And for Somalia, especially what we have seen in the Aden region, Ethiopia, remember when the Chinese were trying to explore some of the oil that they thought they found there, over, 30 or 70 some Chinese workers were killed. And because the reason was the conflict there, Somalis saying, ethnic Somalis saying this is ours, and the Ethiopian government saying this is Ethiopian land. That's one problem. Another problem that oil could bring, that we have already seen some problems, is that some of the already mentioned oil that was found in the northern region, whether it's the northwest and northeast, between, of course, the Puntland and Somaliland had some problems there, and then the region that squeezed between them, which is the Sol Sanag Ain, or some call Qatuma, and then Sanag, that also, which is part of Somaliland for the Somalilanders in the northwestern region, and for the Puntlanders they say it's ours. So you have, and then that region really is where the oil is concentrated, or at least that's what we're being told. So you already have this conflict that could create a destabilizing scenario for these stable regions. So all these issues are really things to look for, and hopefully come up a solution on how to prevent the violence there.
Thank you. Let's take two more, please.
My name is Muhammad Ali. I'm chair of Somali American Peace Council. First of all, I want to thank you, Mary, for writing such a good book. And I would say we'll give you a green card, what they call it in this country. It's basically citizenship, or residence. I don't know what they call it in the UK. So is David. The great man who always helps us about Somali issue. We love you, David. I have two things here. Since now we have a president who's very credible and a new speaker who's also very well respected, are we going to treat Somalia as a sovereign nation, deal with them like that, or this could be our Secretary of State is saying? Because that's basically undercutting them. Rather, we really not to work with their partners and use Somali Americans as a bridge. My next thing is Somalia is a natural resource rich, not only oil. We have uranium. We get two main rivers that if used with the right technology, that you can feed 10 times more than Somali population, and so on and so on and so forth. And Somalis are known to be not only, warriors, they're good in fighting, but they're also good in many things like making, commerce and all this other stuff. Why can't we get investments, not aid? We really don't need aid in Africa. It's actually a disaster. My last point is, why don't we help to build a Somali security force? Thank you for African Union for helping us, but to have a long-term peace, you need your own forces. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Omar?
Hi, Omar Dyer from the British Embassy. I haven't read your book either, but I have bought it, so I guess it's the same to you either way now. Yeah. Just had a question. I've only been following Somalia for a year, so I can't go back to 20 years, and I can see, given the state that Somalia has been in, that a lot must have gone wrong. But the year I've been following it has been, I guess, more energetic than I expected on the Somalia portfolio. And in some ways more optimistic, but listening to the discussion today has actually been quite depressing. The title of your book is What Went Wrong, but I wonder if you could also give a bit of an indication of how we get it right going forward. What should the international community be doing? Because some of the ways that the US And if we take the US as a symbol for the international community more widely, as been talked about this afternoon, it seems a bit like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So, for example, is the greater international engagement that we've seen on Somalia over the last year, and that brought with it, I think, bringing together some of the diverse range of countries on Somalia, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And how do we take it forward? And I think some of our Somali colleagues have talked about the government being sovereign, and I think that's certainly important. And one of the temptations for the international community in these situations always seems to be to micromanage it for the government going forward, which I think would be a mistake. But how else can we help now?
Thank you. Let me just add, I have here a bunch of questions from people who are in the overflow rooms here who couldn't make it into this room. One of them is, how or when do you think the international community, especially the U.S., will get Somalia right? So very much along the same lines of Omar's question. So we have that, and we have the security force, we have natural resources, and similar question of treating Somalia as a sovereign nation. That's a lot. Who wants to start? Go ahead, Bronwyn.
Thanks. I'm really glad that the question about the Somali security forces came up, because as I alluded in my opening remarks, I really believe that that's one of the primary challenges that the international community is going to have to tackle over the next couple of years, is how long does AMISOM stay, how do they gracefully leave, and what will be enough to make actors like Washington feel that they have a finger on the pulse of Somalia and can monitor the situation to ensure U.S. security without being an overbearing presence on the Somali people. And that's going to be tremendously challenging. Particularly because the Somali security forces, as they stand now, are not an army at all, but really a collection of militias who are loyal to various people who are not necessarily going to remain loyal to the government. And so the idea of handing over to those, I'm going to call them warlords, even though it's derogatory and I don't intend it in that way, but those militia leaders, it's not a satisfying solution to anybody, and it's likely not going to happen. But the alternative is that AMISOM stays in Somalia for a very long time, and I think that that's not particularly satisfying either, at least to the Somalis. And so some kind of progress is going to have to be made, but how, I think, is a really unanswerable question at this stage. And if anybody has a thought, please come and get my business card, because I'd really like to hear it. On the getting it right, I think the best kept secret among Somalia watchers is that it's actually really hard to get it wrong in Somalia. The one thing that the international community keeps doing wrong is that they focus on politicking and governance too soon, when the issue is the economy. The issue is always the economy, and if people would only try to work on making Somalis' daily lives better, almost anything they do would be tremendously helpful. If you go outside and stop any Somali on the street and you say, I have $100,000 for a project, they will have 25 ideas within 30 seconds, all of which will be useful. I guarantee it. I absolutely guarantee it. But the issue is that cash-strapped foreign governments just don't have the time to invest in that just grassroots, bottom up, teach people to read, get people a job, conflict resolution through opportunity kind of effort. They care about getting a horse in Mogadishu. They care about guaranteeing security. And until policymakers become convinced that the real solution is in a really long-term, unglamorous, probably expensive, maybe we'll see some progress 10 years down the line kind of effort, we're going to continue to have the getting it wrong kind of approaches.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I'll just give an example. Earlier this year, I drove from Somalia to Addis Ababa, and the road going to the border with Ethiopia was you could barely describe it as a road. It was full of potholes, it was sand, it was terrible. And Somalia exports more live animals than anywhere else on earth, so you see these kind of massive trucks bringing in some animals from Ethiopia and the outlying areas, and they're just, you can't believe how they managed to get through these roads, and fresh produce, and the cat that the Somalis chew, which has to be fresh. It was just awful seeing the sort of economy being destroyed by bad or non-existent roads. As soon as we got to the border with Ethiopia, there was a road that is better than the roads in America. It was this gorgeous new road that had been built by the Chinese, and we just whizzed down to Addis Ababa in a matter of hours, when it had taken us tens of hours to make a journey a tenth that long within Somali territories. So I just think that infrastructure, it's boring, it's not glamorous, as you say, it's expensive, but it will turn things around for Somalis. And one thing that I felt in Mogadishu, certainly, which is a place which is just on the cusp of either falling into more violence, or if people have more to win from peace than from war, they'll go for peace. You know, you think if Mogadishu could have more functioning infrastructure, it would have more of a chance of becoming a peaceful, prosperous place. So I do think that that's something that attention could be focused on. And I mean, Bronwyn, I suppose, has spoken for me in terms of the security forces, but I don't really understand why, when Somalis are the best fighters in the region, and there has been a lot of training of Somali military personnel in places like Uganda and other neighbouring countries, why are they still not kind of being formed into a more conventional, I suppose, police force, army, military? I mean, there's so much investment in Somalia from the outside world in terms of trying to sort out the politics. Why can't there have been an equal amount of attention paid to creating a unified military? I know it's incredibly difficult, but you think, I mean, without that, Somalia's just not going to get anywhere, I'm afraid.
There were several questions, but I think some of them we addressed earlier. But the security issue, the economy, and how to get Somalia right, that's the Somalia right, how to get Somalia right, that's your book coming up. But I will also mention, but security issue, and I see the issue of the Somali military keeps coming back, and that's always the question that I hear: how come Somalis cannot get it together? And of course, I want to put some blame on the Somalis because they're not coherent, and there is a loyalty to the clan and the militias and everything. But there is an underlying issue, and I don't hear the mainstream media addressing this, and also the nations that pay majority of the funding to the Amazon troops also do not address this issue. And for me, I believe it's a double standard, because what you have is true. About 10,000 Somali soldiers have been trained so far in Uganda, in Kenya, different places. Some have been even flown overseas. But the problem with this is you have people trained outside the country, in Uganda, for example, and then you have, when they trained in Uganda, the Ugandese, and this is a fact, actually one of the articles published by Somalia's special envoy to the United States has, Mr. Abubakar Arman, the gentleman that you were talking about earlier, has mentioned this, and what he was talking about is how you have troops trained in Uganda, and the person who trained was coming from Spain or Portugal, and the training, when it takes place, is in English, but they had to hire someone who speaks Swahili, who can speak to the trainer, the other one who speaks Swahili, and the Swahili has to employ someone who speaks Somali, and that person has to talk to the soldier who's being trained, and imagine how much gets lost in the translation. And then you have these people, whether they trained in Uganda or Kenya, brought back into Somalia, and there's no collaboration and coordination between them. And there is also some who feel they were trained in a better country, therefore they don't need to listen to the one who was trained, the country who's less developed. So that conflict also exists. And another issue that's very serious is the issue of funding. The Somali soldiers each was getting $100 per soldier, where the Amazon soldier was getting $800 per soldier. And then there's additional $1,200 that goes into the account of the government that sent per soldier. So you have a soldier who gets paid $100, and if they get injured in the battleground, they're taken off the salary. They don't get paid. So this is the problem. Therefore, the soldier who gets paid $100, if he is armed, trained, and able to fight, and he can get paid by Al-Shabaab $800, is he going to stay with the military? No. And this is where the international community has missed the whole point of training the Somali soldiers. It's useless to do that if you're not paying them. There has to be sustainable. Way to address this issue. Sustaining their salary is one of the things that the international community can do, instead of investing in these foreign soldiers. Kenya right now is inside Kismayo, and I'm glad you talked about earlier, and you talked about in your book before they of course they not captured, but they entered the city. The head of the military, the second man in Somalia, yesterday said for the Kenyan soldiers not to go into Kismayo because they were afraid of the bloodshed, of what could go wrong. But of course they did not heed his advice. They went inside the city. Now all hell can break loose because you have Shabab who say they left the city, but we don't know if they really left or they just melted into the society. And then you have the Kenyans. So anything can happen. It's a very delicate balance. It's a ticking bomb that's taking what's happening in Kismayo right now. So that's an issue. So without having sustained salary for the Somali soldiers, we can train all the soldiers in the world, but so it's not going to do any good. And the economy, the Somalis have done an amazing job. I've seen in your book, the telecommunication-wise, the cheapest and the best mobile system in all of Africa. Last 20 years, imagine. And then the remittance, they established the transfer company called Hawala. So they can do this. We just have to really address the issues in the right way.
Thank you. I have two more questions from the other room, and then we're going to add that to the final question here. Thank you for your patience, and we'll conclude with that big batch. Other questions from next door. What are the next steps in terms of encouraging economic progress in Somalia? Are there any attempts to encourage investment, particularly from the Somali diaspora or the largest business community? We've talked some about what's going on, but any recommendations for the future? Second question from next door. Don't you think that Ethiopia should be held more accountable for all the problems in Somalia? And please add yours.
All right, thank you for hosting the event. I'm Mark Yarnell with Refugees International, and just spent most of last week in Mogadishu. And you're right, Mary, it's not quite a paradise. I mean, there's obviously a level of revitalization, rebuilding going on, but in spite of that, I think I want to sort of follow up to your comment about the militarization of the city. And I think what was quite astounding was the degree to which, I shouldn't be surprised, but the degree to which local entities have been able to kind of consolidate control in certain parts of the city. Part of that includes controlling IDP camps or displacement camps, diverting aid to sort of build up their own wealth. And in terms of the new government or the Somali local governments being able to have more influence just in Mogadishu, let alone outside of in other parts of the country. You mentioned how hard it would be to get local militias to trust the Somali police force. How does Hassan Sheikh even begin that process, let alone getting the current security forces on his side, getting the localized militias who might have loyalties at other places to kind of, buy into a national police force, or even just, like I said, just to control Mogadishu? Thanks.
Thank you. So let's take those three questions and any sort of concluding remarks you want to make as well. Mary, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll address the Ethiopia question. Somalia and Ethiopia have never been friends, and they probably never will be friends. So they have to learn to live with each other. I don't think it would be fair to blame Ethiopia entirely for Somalia's problems, but Ethiopia is at an advantage because Somalia has been weak in lots of ways for so long, and it serves Ethiopia's purposes to have a weak and fractured Somalia as long as it has a buffer zone between it and Somalia, and that is essentially what it's done at the moment. It has much more quietly than 2006 sent its troops into Somalia this time. It also, I think, a bit like the United States, has learned you keep quiet and you keep back, but you still keep your hands in there. So Ethiopia has, with some allied militias, Somali militias, formed some kind of protective belt along its border. It will be interesting to see whether anything changes now that the Ethiopian strongman Meles Zenawi is no more. I really wonder what that will mean for Ethiopia's policy towards Somalia, and we'll all just have to keep our eyes open. But also Ethiopia is one of the United States' kind of key allies in the region in the war on terror, and I presume it will continue to play that card to ensure US support for itself and US support for furthering its interests in Somalia, so that it is something that anybody who's thinking about Somalia should always be aware that you can't think about Somalia without thinking about Ethiopia. In terms of my concluding remarks, I wish the new president and the government that his prime minister, yet to be named, will form, I wish them all the luck in the world, and they do have massive, massive challenges. But also, from my last trip to Mogadishu, there was this, I called it in one of my pieces, I called it a fragile hope. There is this incredible spirit of optimism that I have not felt there ever since I've started reporting on life in Somalia. So if somehow that optimism that is now being channeled towards this new administration as well, if that can be coupled with some real sensible policies from the Somalis, but also from the foreign community, in particular in elements, I would say, of security and infrastructure, and getting those foreign troops out as soon as possible, then maybe Somalia, I have started to think Somalis are so brilliant at business. I don't really think they need a huge amount of foreign aid or investment. I think with their own acumen, they could become the Dubai of Africa. So I think there could be a very, very bright future ahead, but not without its huge challenges. Thank you.
Very, very briefly, I'm glad that the issue of Ethiopia was raised. And I do agree with Mary that it's going to be very interesting to see what, post the death of Zenawi, the Somalia policy looks like. I suspect it will look very similar, but I suspect that the U.S. stance on Ethiopia might be very different. I think that Ethiopia has gotten away with an awful lot, in large part because Meles Zenawi himself was so charismatic. And I think with Ethiopia's role in the war on terror becoming less and less important, and Uganda playing such a large role instead, and also with the rise of Haile Mariam, who seems not to be as adroit as Meles was in explaining his country's repressive policies, I think you might see a lot less wiggle room for Ethiopia in the future. Accountability may be too much to ask for, but I don't think they'll get quite the same pass that they've had in the past. On the economy, I also agree with Mary. I think that you could probably dump money on Somalia and literally watch it spout into flowers on the ground. I really share the same respect for the entrepreneurial spirit there. But I would really want to emphasize that one thing that the U.S. could do that would be tremendously helpful would be to normalize the status of the Hawalas. The fact that the Hawalas have been so persecuted and so regularly shut down because of confusion over their status and because of U.S. fears about terror financing has really put a crimp in the ability of Somalis to send money to their families when it's sorely needed, and also to invest in businesses that would really help the situation in Somalia to become better. So I would strongly urge that the U.S. does anything that it start to look at that. And finally, on Hassan Sheikh, for whom I have nothing but the best wishes, obviously. I think he has a really hard road ahead. I think it's very clear that he's one of a number of actors who have a lot of influence going forward, but not enough influence. And I have to say that the fact that Kenya invaded Kismayo without an explicit go-ahead or without even informing him that they planned that attack is a real indication of the limitations of his power. Personally, you know, I think that as far as accountability goes, the Kenyans deserve a bit of a slap on the wrist for that. It's not a helpful thing. It doesn't set him on the right path. And I think that a statement to that effect would be useful indeed as well. But I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Sadia, last words to you.
The questions that come from the overflow room I'm concerned. I don't want them to think we're neglecting them. On the issue of Ethiopia, you're right, I agree with you. The Somalis are not blameless. Of course, Ethiopians would not be able to arm anybody if the warlords or the militias have not gone to Ethiopia and seek the support of Meles, who is no longer with us. I saw an Ethiopian smiling back there. But what I want to say is, and you mentioned this in your book, something that we didn't talk about, is the humanitarian catastrophe that resulted from that invasion, December 2006. What happened between January of 2007 until the Ethiopians withdrew? What the human rights organizations are reporting is about 23,000 people being killed, but that really only what we know. But worse than that for us activists and for the Somalis in the diaspora and inside Somalia was 1.5 million became displaced from their homes, and 3.5 million became turned out to be on the verge of starvation. And then you had the people who left the country and went to Dadaab, refugee camp that was built for 90,000 people. Today is a home, as you mentioned earlier, to 500,000 people. So I think the reason I'm mentioning this is one of the ways for the international community or the diaspora going back to invest in will be the resettlement programs, building homes that are sustainable for these refugees to come back home. Because you have 500,000 refugee camp in Dadaab, and then you have almost another little Mogadishu inside Kenya, Slee. And then you have in Uganda and neighboring countries where all the Somalis have settled. So resettling, especially the refugees, women and children, women who have lost their husbands, who have lost their fathers, children who've lost their fathers, their parents. Resettling these should be a priority. Security, of course, because without security, without peace, nothing can be established. So resettling those would be wonderful. As far as the Somali government and how it can influence, the question that the president, how he can influence Mogadishu or outside Mogadishu, the question that was asked last. I believe the president is on the right track. Today, I just was reading that he went to Baydabo, and that was to show and assert his authority as a president. Now is not a transition, a permanent government. And from what I understand, he will be traveling the rest of the country. And that is a wonderful move for him. But it will also depend on the prime minister that he chooses. And then that will depend, of course, the cabinet that prime minister puts together. So all those things will predict which way Somalia will move. But the most important thing is for the international community to decide if Somalia is in transition or it's in permanent state. That has to be decided. And as last word, what I want to say is thank you, Mary, for writing this book. I really mean it, because when I was reading, I kept saying that why did she decide to write this book? Because everyone else was refusing to listen to things that we have been saying. Nothing has succeeded so far. So try the Somali model. And you have stated it here, so I want to thank you for that. And for the international community and for all of you sitting here, Somalia is not in permanent state of failure anymore. They have the resilience, they have shown it. I'm sorry I'm taking too much long, but I think we need to support that resilience and the hope that they have projected and they've shown with this new president, new life that's showing. Thank you.
Thank you. Great way to end. Thank you very much.